On December 12, 2022, the Azerbaijan military enacted a blockade in this little 3-mile stretch of land. On one side of this military blockade is Armenia, a country that has been longtime enemies of Azerbaijan, and a country that is allies with Russia. This detail will be important for later. And then on the other side of this blockade, we have a much more complicated story. This area of mountainous land is known as the Nagorno-Karabakh region, and depending on who you ask, is either part of Armenia, part of Azerbaijan, or even part of neither, and is its own independent territory. 95% of the people living in the Nagorno-Karabakh region are Armenian, even though the land technically belongs to Azerbaijan. Pretty much any map you look at doesn't carve out any special borders for the Nagorno-Karabakh region. All maps typically show this land as belonging to Azerbaijan. The only problem is, Armenia and its allies don't see it this way. When Azerbaijan built up their military presence here on December 12, 2022, they were preventing Armenians from coming into the Nagorno-Karabakh region and were also preventing any Armenians from leaving this region to go back into Armenia. This is one of the most fought-over 3-mile stretches of land in the world and is known as the Lachin Corridor. Although this land fully belongs to Azerbaijan, a thin mountain road that looks like this was what allowed Armenians to travel back and forth between the Nagorno-Karabakh region and the Armenian mainland. Once the Azerbaijan military blocked this road, the over 120,000 Armenians living in this region were shut off from access to many essential goods, services, and even their families. The hospitals in the Nagorno-Karabakh region soon didn't have enough electricity to keep their patients alive, and many hospitals and pharmacies closed altogether. Schools were only open for 4 hours a day because this was all the time they could afford to heat the school for. The gas was only accessible at your house for 6 hours a day, and the death toll soon started rising rapidly. Now you'd think this would start receiving major media attention and pushback against Azerbaijan for cutting off this vital road, except Azerbaijan didn't claim responsibility for this blockade. Instead, they disguised their military as environmental protesters who were refusing to leave the region until their wishes were met. This was a strategic move to cut off this region from Armenia by putting the blame on protesters. The only problem was, nobody really believed it. Just by looking at these protesters, these strong, physically fit men don't resemble the typical environmentalists that you see protesting in many other countries. Azerbaijan finally agreed to remove these protesters and replace them with their own military, which actually just ended up being a wardrobe change for these fake environmentalists. The Azerbaijan military then admitted to enforcing this blockade, with their reasoning being Armenia had been shipping their military equipment and personnel to this region. Armenia later denied this claim. Azerbaijan actually offered to aid the struggling Armenians in the Nagorno-Karabakh region, but Armenia denied this offer as they wouldn't accept aid from the people causing the crisis in the first place. Finally, 9 months after this blockade was first enacted, as the region was now very weak, Azerbaijan carried out what they called an anti-terrorist offensive in the Nagorno-Karabakh region that was aimed at weakening Armenia's military. Within just 2 days, Azerbaijan had gained total control over this region, and tens of thousands of Armenians were attempting to flee, racing back towards Armenia's mainland. The death toll from this anti-terrorist offensive wasn't as high as the previous conflicts between these two countries, but Armenia reported that at least 28,120 Armenians had fled the Nagorno-Karabakh region and made their way back into Armenia to find a new home. This 2-day offensive ended when Russia got involved and proposed a peace treaty where supposed Russian peacekeepers would patrol the Lachin Corridor. Armenia agreed to this deal because they have actually been allies with Russia and are one of the countries under the CSTO, which is basically Russia's version of NATO. In fact, there's actually Russian troops all over Armenia, and especially on the southern end, preventing Azerbaijan from accessing their exclave to the west. But just by looking at these strange borders, you're probably wondering why Azerbaijan has this random stretch of land not attached to the mainland. Additionally, if we zoom to other parts of the country, there's actually even smaller enclaves of Azerbaijan in Armenia, and likewise with small enclaves of Armenia in Azerbaijan. These enclaves and exclaves are important to point out, as this brings us back to why both countries are fighting over the Nagorno-Karabakh region in the first place. Both Armenia and Azerbaijan were once part of the Soviet Union, where this land was governed under Moscow. Under the Soviet Union, there were 15 different republics. The Moscow leadership began drawing rough lines for Armenia and Azerbaijan's borders, as these would be 2 of the 15 republics. There were certain villages in Armenia that had almost all Azerbaijan citizens, and then certain villages in Azerbaijan that had almost all Armenian citizens, the Nagorno-Karabakh region being one of them. Moscow and the Soviet Union tried splitting up the land to keep the ethnic groups connected together, but some of these regions were left out. Armenia believed the Nagorno-Karabakh region should have been given to Armenia, with their heavy Armenian influence in the region, while Azerbaijan thought this would have been too much land to be pulled out from the middle of the country. By 1988, the Soviet Union was crumbling, and the Armenians living in the Nagorno-Karabakh region took advantage of the power vacuum and took a vote for the land to be handed over to Armenia. There was no real legitimate government to say no to this vote, considering the Soviet Union had much bigger problems at the time than dealing with this land to the south. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, violence erupted in this region for the first time, where there was a massive war over who controlled the land between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The First Nagorno-Karabakh War, which lasted from 1991 to 1994, resulted in roughly 30,000 casualties between both sides. Russia was the one who was able to broker a ceasefire where both countries agreed the Nagorno-Karabakh region would be left independent. Under this treaty, the independent land would have a self-proclaimed government operated out of Stepanakert. Although there was a ceasefire in place, both countries continued to violate the ceasefire throughout the next couple decades. Random shelling would take place, and there would be smaller acts of violence close to the border. Violence didn't fully ramp up until 16 years later after this original ceasefire in the year 2020. After a summer of cross-border attacks, the second all-out war broke out between these two countries in late September of 2020 during the height of the COVID pandemic. During this second Nagorno-Karabakh war that took place in 2020, thousands of lives were lost on both sides, and tens of thousands were injured. Yet, you never really heard about this war, partly due in fact to COVID being the media's #1 concern. The United States, other NATO countries, and even Russia were urging the two sides to stop fighting, but neither listened, and the war ramped up even more when the two sides began using heavier military weaponry. Finally, 6 weeks after the war began, now on November 9th, 2020, Russia brokered a peace deal to end this conflict. This time, the Nagorno-Karabakh region was not autonomous. The region was officially declared land of Azerbaijan. Russia would also now monitor the Lachin Corridor, which sounded like it would have been in Armenia's favor, given Russia was one of their allies. Instead, Russia hasn't done much to ensure peace in this region and has been relatively absent with their war going on in Ukraine. Although this was a massive win for Azerbaijan, the fighting likely won't stop just at the Nagorno-Karabakh region. The reason this is an ongoing war, and one that is likely to ramp up even more in the future, is because of this region of land right here. This is known as the Zangezur Corridor, and is potentially even more important to Azerbaijan than the Nagorno-Karabakh region is. In fact, this Zangezur Corridor is also extremely important for much larger countries, like Turkey and even the rest of NATO. You see, Azerbaijan has been growing rapidly as a country because of their crude oil drilling capabilities in the land near the Caspian Sea. Azerbaijan on average drills over 200 times the amount of oil that the country uses on a yearly basis. This means the vast majority of this oil is being exported largely to its allies like Turkey, Israel, Italy, and Spain. The only problem with exporting this oil is that Azerbaijan is surrounded mostly by its enemies. To the south is Iran, who is also a major exporter of oil and doesn't want to assist one of their competitors. To the west is obviously Armenia, who won't allow Azerbaijan oil to pass through their land. And then due north is Russia, who is not only an ally of Armenia, but also is another massive exporter of oil themselves. This leaves Azerbaijan to export oil only through the country of Georgia and then back into Turkey before it can be then shipped out to the rest of the European Union through the Mediterranean Sea. Azerbaijan was once able to export oil directly to Turkey when the Zangezur Corridor provided direct access to Azerbaijan's exclave. Once the fighting between these two countries began, Armenia denied access through this point and sent in Russian soldiers to monitor this land. This led to those in Azerbaijan to have to travel through Iran if they wanted to visit their exclave to the west. Armenia also shut down the railroad They used to pass through this corridor. If Azerbaijan were to take control of this corridor, they would then have direct access to Turkey thanks to another thin strip of land that just barely connects Turkey with the Azerbaijan exclave. With Azerbaijan's recent wins in the Nagorno-Karabakh region, they are likely eyeing down the Zangezur corridor next. The past battles between Azerbaijan and Armenia haven't been very equal, where Azerbaijan is now spending $2.6 billion a year on their military, while Armenia is spending closer to $1.3 billion. Azerbaijan has 380,000 total military personnel compared to Armenia's 259,000. Azerbaijan also has the help from NATO countries, with one of their closest allies being Israel. In fact, Israel and Azerbaijan just made a deal where Israel was able to set up their military air bases in Azerbaijan in exchange for Azerbaijan being able to access Israel's Iron Dome technology. Now that Israel has air bases in Azerbaijan, they also have a much more direct path to their enemy to the south, Iran. In addition, Azerbaijan is also much more protected from Armenia's airstrikes, with Israel's top-of-the-line Iron Dome technology. With Azerbaijan growing much faster economically and militarily than Armenia, it's likely only a matter of time before they try gaining control of the Zangezur corridor. Having access to this corridor would allow Azerbaijan direct access to shipping their oil to NATO countries, rather than being dependent on Georgia to allow their oil to pass through. Relying on Georgia is a risky move for Azerbaijan, considering this country has been in recent conflict with Russia. Russia has been proven to be a loose cannon when it comes to taking back lost Soviet land, with an example of this being the recent invasion into Ukraine. In fact, this invasion into Ukraine is one of the major reasons why you never hear about the Armenia and Azerbaijan war. The Russian invasion took place right around the same time that Azerbaijan started enacting this blockade to the Nagorno-Karabakh region. While Armenians were starving and dying at staggering rates in this region, you never really heard about it, since just to the north, Vladimir Putin was directing the Russian military into the eastern oblasts of Ukraine. While this invasion into Ukraine has certainly warranted media coverage, it's almost like the media could have cared less about the wars taking place in other regions around the globe. One war the media is definitely paying attention to is the Israel and Palestine war. This is largely in part to Israel being a heavy beneficiary from the United States aid. This aid has helped Israel build what they call the Iron Dome, which is just one of the reasons why this country has become OP. To learn about the other reasons as to why Israel has become overpowered, check out this video right here.